Good evening and welcome to the latest in our FCC speaker series. I'm Rebecca Bailey. Before we kick off tonight's event, I just want to flag one coming up on Wednesday at 8 p.m. as well. Professor Ivan Hung from HKU will be here to answer all of your questions about the coronavirus vaccine and variants, so do tune in for that. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's discussion with not one but two very distinguished guests. In September 2020, relations between China and Australia worsened, resulting in a 5-day diplomatic standoff, during which the two remaining members of the Australian press corps had to be evacuated from the PRC. And those journalists are joining us here tonight, Birtles and Michael Smith. Michael Smith's been covering China for 20 years. He's currently the China correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. He's actually also an old Hong Konger, I've learned. He was a political reporter at the Hong Kong Standard in the 1990s. He moved to Shanghai in early 2018, where he reported up until his abrupt departure. His first book, The Last Correspondent: Dispatches from the Front Lines of Xi's New China, has just been published. Bill Birtles used to be the ABC's China correspondent from 2015 onwards until he also had to leave. He studied Mandarin in Beijing before working for Xinhua, the Chinese state media, and he's also just written a book called The Truth About China. He's just taken up a new role as the ABC's Indonesia bureau chief, so we're really happy to have him tonight. There's plenty to discuss, so just a reminder, you can send questions to question@fcchk.org. That's question singular at fcchk.org. So do send them through. We'll put them through to Bill and Michael. Enough of me. Let me hand you over to Keith Richburg, our moderator and FCC president.
Why, thank you very much, Rebecca. And I believe we'll see more of you when we get audience questions. And we're going to let Rebecca field the audience questions. So you guys are stuck with me. Sorry about that. But, welcome. Thank you for doing this. I know it's late in Australia, so we really appreciate your being able to do it at our convenient time here. But before we really get into the meat of it, let me just ask, Michael Smith, you're actually in Tasmania. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm sort of on the Tasmanian leg of my book tour, I suppose. But I was actually born here, so I'm sort of down here visiting my parents and doing some stuff for the book as well. So it's very cold down here, and I'm sure it's strange to you guys that we can travel anywhere.
Exactly. And one other question on Tasmania. I've heard that the Tasmanian devil is making a comeback. Is that correct?
So I've heard. You probably know more than me, but yeah, they had a cancer scare, but apparently they're reproducing it en masse again, so they're back.
Okay, and Bill Birtles, before we get into the meat of it, you are not actually in Jakarta, although you are the Jakarta bureau chief. Where are you?
No, unfortunately, because the Indonesian borders are shut, I can't get to Jakarta yet to take up my posting. So I'm at home in Sydney. I'm a Sydney boy, so a bit like Mike, I'm doing this from my hometown.
All right, well, great. I was in Jakarta for the Washington Post before, and before we start, Bill, in your book, you talked about your partner being pregnant when you had to leave during this amazing adventure to get out of. What happened now? Tell us. Has your family expanded?
Yeah, as of today, in fact, we have a 2-month-old baby boy named Casper. And he's well, he's healthy, he's a bit fat actually, he's putting on weight and likes to feed. So all's good on that front.
All right, well, that's good news, some really good news. And hopefully you'll be able to get some sleep. Casper will allow you to sleep for a bit. But really, let's jump right into it. Let's stay with you, Bill, because I mean, the intro to your book was incredibly dramatic. You get this call basically saying, you got to get out right now, but you weren't given a lot of information about why by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. You ended up at the embassy. I mean, that must have been pretty dramatic or traumatic, at least the way you described it. You didn't even know if you could have a going away party, and then you get this knock at the door and there are policemen outside. I mean, I know it's in the book, but just for the audience, just tell us a little bit about what was in your mind, your emotion at that time.
Well, it was very unexpected. People look at the Australia-China relationship, unraveling over the past few years, and yeah, this all sort of fits into it, sure. But at the time, you're working in Beijing, you're reporting on things, but your life all seems quite normal. And so the thing I most vividly remember is a sense of disbelief when I was getting these warnings from Australian diplomats that you're at risk of being arrested by national security police for your own safety. We want you on a flight ASAP to get out of there. I didn't really believe it. I wanted to sort of really suss it out and fight it, basically, because we were keen to stay. We'd sorted out our life plans to try and stay for another, well, we were going to stay for another year at least in Beijing, have a kid up there. So that was the feeling for me. It wasn't this sort of fear or anything like that. It was just disbelief that this was happening.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, you were in a little bit different situation. You were in Shanghai, living in the French concession. I lived in the French concession there as well. You know, you're a little bit away from the politics of Beijing. It's more of an economic story. So you're covering more of China society, et cetera. You're not really there, and it's a little bit less repressive, if I could use that word. I mean, so it must have been a bit of a shock to you as well, correct, to get that call?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you know, living in Shanghai, it's a glitzy commercial city. You can sort of forget what country you're in at times. And like Bill, when the warnings first came from our government, we didn't really quite believe it. We didn't really take them too seriously. We actually thought they were playing politics with us, and that we didn't need to get out of China at all. So it was sort of all rather dramatic when things did escalate, and you get that knock on the door. I mean, I was probably in a different situation than Bill. Bill had some people round to his house when the Ministry of State Security or the public security guys turned up, but I was sort of fast asleep and woke up and didn't really know what was going on. So it was all sort of pretty terrifying at the time, but it turns out it was all a bit of a, there was a lot of theatrics involved, and I think it was designed to intimidate. But yeah, like Bill said, I mean, I never felt unsafe in China. I always thought the worst thing that could happen to me is that I'd be deported, like a lot of American journalists have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it was in your book, Bill, you mentioned that at the time when this was going on, you didn't realize what had happened to the Chinese journalist in Australia. You didn't actually realize that they had been, stopped and their houses searched by Australian federal police. Is that correct?
Yeah, Keith, that's correct. We were in the dark about that. It actually had happened about 6 weeks or so before this all went down in Beijing. What we, of course, knew at the time was that about 2 weeks before we got these warnings, the Australian CCTV anchor Cheng Lei had been detained, although we didn't initially know that. In fact, it was the day I found, I shouldn't laugh, but, I think back on the sequence of events, it was the day I found out that I got this phone call. I was just reporting it when I got the phone call. So we were sort of in the dark about that for the first, 12 days or so of her detention. So that's why it came as such a shock, because a lot had been happening in the background, but we weren't privy to this information. And had you told me at the time that the Australians, the ASIO in Australia had raided 4 Chinese state journalists, actually, I wouldn't kind of be that surprised, but I'd be surprised nonetheless, just because it's a huge story. And the fact that it was kept under wraps until basically we were back home, and it was the Chinese media that revealed it. The penny dropped. We sort of thought there's something going on here, just we can't quite work out what it is. And then once we were finally back in Australia, we thought, well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? This is retaliation for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Bill, I think you wrote as well that it's kind of weird position for you to have been in, because you were part of this big story, but then you couldn't report that story, and you were kind of keeping things from the journalists who were your friends because you were still in this position where you needed to get out of China. I mean, that must have been a very weird position for a journalist who's used to writing everything they know, right?
Yeah, because, I mean, the thing is, we're sitting there in the embassy in Beijing, or Mike was in the consul building in Shanghai. And quite a few journalists actually knew, because I've got mates up in Beijing, and I didn't, they turned up to my place when I told them that, look, if something's going down, I need some help packing. It wasn't really a farewell party. It was a case of come around and try and just take anything you need. I'm desperately trying to get my life sorted. And so a few of them did know, but they all respectfully held off because there was this concern at the time from the Australian diplomats, of course, that if the story broke in the Australian media, then it might force the Chinese side to dig in. And if we, for example, are holed up taking shelter at these embassies, supposedly avoiding Chinese investigators in a national security case, then it looks like the Australian government's interfering by preventing us from doing the interviews and so forth. So, you know, it was this perverse feeling where, you know, there are all these cases of foreigners getting caught in trouble in China in national security cases or whatnot. And so often, or drug smuggling or whatever it is. And so often you're trying to talk to their families as a journalist, and clearly the families have been advised by the diplomats to keep their heads down. You know, the best thing in China is to do it behind closed doors. And so here we were in a spot of bother, and we were sort of doing the same thing. We were, you know, trying to keep it all on the download until we were safely out. It did feel weird.
Yeah. And Michael, what was you were kind of in a different position because there must not be that many Australian journalists who are based in Shanghai at the time, or that many people you could talk to at the time, right? It's a smaller press corps, et cetera. What was it like for you during that period of time?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm certainly the only Australian journalist in Shanghai. I mean, I think Bill and I were the only two journalists left working for Australian media outlets at the time. But yeah, look, as Bill said, it was a very surreal experience. The irony of, you know, we were always complaining that the Australian Foreign Affairs Department doesn't tell us anything, and then here we are sort of, you know, encouraging them not to tell anyone anything. And I think, I mean, we were, you know, I was sitting there in the Consul General's house, you know, wondering if I was going to be the next Julian Assange, and our governments were involved in sort of very delicate high-level negotiations with sort of very senior people in the Ministry of State Security. So obviously very delicate negotiations. So it was really vital at that time to sort of keep it under wraps. As Bill said, as soon as it goes public, it really complicates everything for the Chinese government. So in the end, they did do this deal, and they sort of did let us go. But yeah, it was very much a situation of, you know, don't tell anyone. I mean, only two very senior editors at my newspaper knew, and, you know, I didn't even call my parents until I was sort of getting on the plane. So it was all sort of very hush hush. But credit to those journalists, especially Bill's mates who sort of did keep it under wraps. It must have been very tempting to go off and write something.
Yeah. Well, I'll just jump in. Without naming names, there is a prominent Australian journalist up in Beijing who was actually over at my place helping me clear out some of these things when I told everyone to come. I didn't tell everyone, I told my close mates, you know, come around, something's going down, I need a hand. But the thing is, as people stayed there, then of course they started to, you know, empty the wine that was in my cupboard, or people went and brought around some beers. And so, you know, we had an FCC group on, Signal or WhatsApp or something up in Beijing. And I was just going to bed after a rather long night because the police turned up at midnight, and, you know, they told us we're in a national security case. And then Mike called me from Shanghai, and, you know, we had a bit of an ordeal. And but we knew we were no longer getting on a plane to evacuate the next day because we had to stay in China. We had an exit ban. So finally, at about, I don't know, 1:32 a.m., I'm getting to bed, and I see this message pop up in the Signal group of the foreign correspondents from an Australian journalist for a British outlet who will go unnamed, who is the great character of the remaining Australian press corps.
Indeed, I think he slept on your couch, actually.
I think he did sleep on my couch. Yeah,
I think you're out
a couple of years. And anyway, he sent this message briefly saying, for all those who, I mean, there was some debate going on in the FCC at the time on the group. You know, people were chattering about something or other, and he sort of almost let the cat out of the bag. He said something like, for all those who, I think it's about the Canadian, the two Michaels or something, I can't remember, but for all those who think the FCC shouldn't issue a statement about this or that, well, things have really escalated tonight. So I was just getting into bed. I say, mate, what are you doing? Delete that message. So it all could have. Luckily, it was sort of 2 a.m, so nobody else would have been up awake to see it. But it all could have gone pear-shaped quite quickly.
All right. Well, we will not name that prominent Australian journalist working for a British outlet who slept on your couch.
That BBC reporter.
But Michael, you could have become the third Michael if things had not gone well.
Yes. Yeah. Well.
But did you know what had happened to the Chinese journalist in Australia at the time, or was that also a surprise to you later?
No, so a complete surprise. And I mean, the strange thing was, we had some pretty heated talks with senior Australian diplomats in the lead up to our departure, and we sort of asked them, is there anything that you're not telling us, or is there any information that would affect our case that you can't share with us? And we were told, no, there isn't. But so look, we don't know who knew what. ASIO doesn't always share information with our Foreign Affairs Department, but that was the scenario presented to us. But as it turned out, and as the Chinese media revealed on the day Bill and I landed back in Australia, there had been raids on the homes of these 4 ASIO journalists. So obviously China often engages in tit for tat, responses to situations. So it was pretty obvious if you knew that something could happen to us. So a very tricky situation. What also happened to me, which is in my book, and I found this out about 3 months after I returned, was that the Ministry of State Security had called up a couple of Chinese nationals who I knew. They weren't sort of close friends, but they were acquaintances, and they were asking them a lot of questions about me. And sort of neighbours have reported that there was a sort of strange car hanging outside our house for some weeks. So it looks like they were sort of keeping an eye on me in the weeks before they took action against us. So obviously trying to sort of get some kind of a case together. So obviously, that when people are being called up, that's also a bit disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can I ask you a question? I know you are both old China hands, and I was covering China in and out from Hong Kong during the 90s from Hong Kong, and then based there from the end of 2009. It seemed to me, and bear with me here for a second, that there was a time when China actually wanted foreign correspondents there. They enjoyed the fact that we foreign correspondents thought China was a big emerging country, and they wanted us there as almost kind of a validation. But now in this last couple of years, we've seen correspondents kicked out from the Wall Street Journal, from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, and now you two. Do you think we've gotten to a point where China thinks they don't really need foreign correspondents anymore? Michael, you go first, and then Bill.
Yeah, I mean, I did a relatively short stint there, but things really changed in my short 3 years, and it was just getting harder and harder to be a reporter. It was getting harder to get people to talk to you. People were too nervous about talking to you, and there was sort of more obstacles thrown in your way every time. And obviously this accelerated a lot after COVID. And I think there was definitely a period, particularly around 2008 and afterwards, and China was really welcoming journalists in and letting them move around the country. But I don't know, it sort of feels like now that China perhaps thinks they don't need us anymore. They've got Twitter, they've got their diplomats on social media sort of spreading their message that way, the Global Times. So perhaps they just think we're a little bit too pesky now, and they don't want us around. I mean, we've got to remember there's still hundreds of foreign correspondents left in China. Obviously, a lot of American journalists have left, but there's still a lot of journalists there. But I think, they all tell me it is getting more and more difficult every day to do their jobs.
Yeah, and what do you think, Bill? I mean, more correspondents have been kicked out of China in the last year than were over the last 20 years combined, I think, if I'm not mistaken, including after the 1989 events. I mean, do you think they feel they no longer need all these correspondents around?
Well, Keith, I do wonder that, now correct me if I'm wrong, because it was a bit before my time, but if we go back to, say, the who, when era, or perhaps before when Jiang Zemin was in, as I understand it, I believe it was more the Hong Kong media that was used in this way, but perhaps the foreign media as well, that occasionally the Hong Kong or the foreign media may be used by, say, factional rivals within the upper echelons of the Communist Party, where they'll place a story that might damage a rival or what have you. And then the foreign media, or particularly the Hong Kong media, would be useful in this way. Now, this was a bit before my time, but I do remember that this was sort of a bit of a thing. I do wonder now, with the way Xi Jinping's running the place and, you know, absolute obsession with controlling everything, that this might also sort of factor into the thinking now that that the foreign media, so long as it's prominent in, so long as the foreign media operates in China in significant numbers, that there's always this risk that somebody within the Chinese system might, you know, leak information to a foreign journalist. And we saw, you know, the greatest Australian journalist, Chris Buckley of the New York Times, him and Austin Ramsey, of course, who's in Hong Kong. The two of them somehow managed to obtain 400 pages of internal government documents about Xinjiang. And they wrote that it was provided by, I believe, somebody in the broadly in the Chinese political establishment, whatever that means. So maybe there's a thinking now in Xi's government that one of the ways to minimize risk, to minimize the threat of people trying to undermine him, would be also to minimize the presence of the foreign media. This is obviously me speculating, but perhaps, yes, having a lot of journalists around in China is seen as more of a risk than an opportunity these days.
That's really interesting analysis and speculation there. You know, I was there during the entire controversy over the former top official in Chongqing, Bo Xilai, and we got many of those scoops by reading the Hong Kong media, because people were leaking things about that case to the Hong Kong media, and then they would circle back into China again. So yeah, you're absolutely right. People kind of, different factions sometimes feel that they could use the foreign press, but very interesting. Let me just broaden it out a little bit and talk a little bit, or ask you guys a little bit about Australia-China relations, because I'll stick with you for a moment, Bill. I know in your book you wrote about how, for example, Kevin Rudd, you know, Chinese-speaking Australian prime minister, tried to improve relations. But I recall, you know, I'm an old guy. I recall going back to Paul Keating, who said, you know, we got to have relations with China. We're an Asian country. You know, we got to have relations with China. And you know, what I guess the question is, we know the relationship deteriorated over time, and it wasn't one big thing. It was a series of little things. But, you know, for the audience here, just what went wrong in this relationship?
Oh,
and I'm coming to you. I'm coming to you next, Michael. Don't worry.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief, because that's the thing. A lot of people up in mainland China in the last few years, they asked me, what the heck's gone wrong, because we can't quite work it out. What are they fighting about? And it's hard to define, because there are many little things. But I suppose a couple of things. Peter Harcher is an Australian journalist over here. He's just published his own book. He said something the other day, which I think is quite striking. He said, Australia basically allowed itself to get economically hooked on a country that it knew nothing about. And it's very true. You know, sort of 1 in 3 exports were going to China, at least in terms of revenue. Currently, it's more than 40%. That's despite China's best efforts to curtail Australian investment. And yet the average Australian, and that includes Australian politicians, Australian businesses, they know bugger all about China. You know, how many of them speak the language? How many of them have the grounding in the politics? How many of them have spent significant time in China? Proportionally, a very, very, very small amount. So I suppose what really happened is, I always like to say the two countries had a relationship like a stock market. It rose from a very low base. They had nothing to do with each other until basically the 1970s. And it boomed once they realized that the two economies were complementary. And there was always going to be a correction when the complete and stark political differences came to the fore. And over the past few years, I think, as Australians, led by the media and also by analysts and university think tanks and so forth, as they've come to realise how the Chinese party state operates in Australia, but also within China itself, I think there's been a pushback to this idea that we must get closer and closer and closer to China. And I think the Chinese government is well aware there's been this pushback. It was on the run of the century. It was making tremendous inroads into Australian public and political life. And to see these measures being taken to try and curtail that, anti-foreign interference laws, or various, blocking Chinese investment in some capacities, I think that's really angered Beijing.
And Michael, you've had the benefit of listening to Bill speak first and moments to contemplate your answer. But what do you think? What went wrong in this relationship that's been building over a couple of decades, really, right?
Yeah, well, what can I add? I think it's sort of things really turned sort of 2017, and obviously there was growing concern in Australia, as there was in the US, about foreign interference and Chinese soft power. And I think people were waking up to a lot of things. And our former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, introduced foreign interference laws that angered China. I think we were the first sort of major Western country to ban Huawei from building our 5G network. So again, that sort of really angered China. And then, you know, back in April last year, our foreign minister made this sort of call for an international inquiry into the origins of coronavirus, which is, as you know, a very sensitive topic in China. So it was sort of a combination of all these actions by the Australian government, I guess. And in the end, it was sort of, that was the final straw for China. But I think China also use this to make an example of Australia. I mean, we're a pretty soft target. I mean, our entire economy relies on China, and there we are. You know, our leaders are sticking the boot in. So I think China saw us as a soft target. As you know, they implemented sort of sanctions and tariffs on billions of dollars worth of our trade, and I think they wanted to make Australia a bit of an example for the rest of the world. I mean, they can pick on us in a way that they can't do to the US. And you know, I think their message has sort of been heard pretty loud and clear.
But Michael, is it working? Are they actually putting the squeeze on the Australian economy, or is the Australian economy now figuring out that there must be some decoupling because of this reaction from China?
Yeah, well, it actually hasn't worked. And of course, it's hurt some industries. If you're a lobster farmer, if you're selling wine to China, I mean, you are really hurting. But our overall trade to China continues to increase, and this has been driven by iron ore, which is our largest export, and iron ore prices can continue to go up. So I think in the short to medium term, China certainly needs our iron ore. That's going to continue for a while. So if you're looking at sort of the overall Australian economy, it is still in reasonably good shape, and it actually hasn't worked. What it does is sort of, it's really turned public opinion in Australia further against China, and it was already going down that path. That, of course, makes it easier for our politicians to implement policies that aren't that friendly to China. So in a way, it hasn't done China any favours. You've got to remember, though, Australia is a pretty sort of minor power. So, I don't know if it's going to make any difference in sort of the overall scheme of things geopolitically.
Well, let me stay with you, because you're on that interesting point, Michael. Australia may be a minor power, but you've signed up now for the Quad, with India and Japan and the United States. I mean, has China's actions against Australia forced Australia to join this kind of new anti-China grouping, if you want to call the Quad that?
Oh, I think it's been a factor in that. I think we probably would have joined it anyway, perhaps at the urgings of the US government. So I think everything you see going on there is sort of probably being driven at the moment by the Biden administration. And of course, powers like Japan have their own concerns about China and their own territorial disputes with China. So I think sort of all those factors combined have contributed to this. But it sort of does really feel like Australia really is in the front line. It's taking all the flack. Our leaders seem to be speaking up against China in a way that no other countries are. I mean, with some of our senior government officials are talking about going to war with China over Taiwan. So you don't really see the US talking in that way. So we sort of seem to be front and center a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Bill, let me bring you in here for a second, because I was interested in something Michael just said about Australian public opinion moving against China. I'm interested in that, because I'm wondering, because you've got some people who want to sell things to China. Anybody who's got a mine, or anybody who's a wine distributor, they want to sell to China. They must be really angry at this, but you must have others who are more interested in things like human rights and these other issues. I mean, where do you see it? I mean, you're in Sydney. Has the Australian public opinion turned, or is it mixed?
It's not really mixed. The Chinese government has shot itself in the foot with Australian public opinion, and you would think that people in the wine industry or the lobster industry would all be uniform in pressuring the Australian government to change its ways on China, but they're not. There was a documentary program the other day on my network, the ABC, where you had lobster growers down in Tasmania saying to camera, look, our business has been destroyed, but our sovereignty is too important. We had a barley grower on the same program in Western Australia saying the same thing. I think China's actions have utterly infuriated a huge amount of Australians, including some of those who are directly affected. And it's because of the way the Chinese government has gone about it. The behaviour has been, it's nothing short of appalling, basically cooking up a bunch of reasons which are blatantly false. There's pests in the timber, there's the barley's being dumped, the wine is being subsidised, there's mercury in the lobsters, there's labelling problems with the beef, the cotton has problem. Week after week after week after week, oh, there's some other little problem. It becomes ludicrous after a while. But also too, because the Chinese government made the minimum effort to try and pretend that these were real problems. So I used to go to these foreign ministry briefings where they'd say, China never politicizes trade. These measures are completely within the rules and regulations, adhere to our laws. But we should say Australian politicians must drop their Cold War mentality, take off their rose-tinted glasses and correct their wrong actions. And I think it's just the sort of blatant way that the Chinese government has gone about it, right to the point where I've done interviews with some sort of proxies for the Chinese government. People like Professor Chen Hong from Shanghai Uni, who is basically a mouthpiece when it comes to his opinions. And I've literally asked him, so let me get this straight. The view in China is that China is 100% right and Australia is 100% wrong. And he's like, yes, that's correct. And whereas in Australia, we have this active China debate. You do have people who love ripping into their own government and saying the Morrison government, Maurice Payne, the foreign minister, they're all idiots. They haven't handled it well. They've got no idea what they're doing about China. As Michael know, you get columnists in his newspaper, the AFR, saying this all the time, like former Ambassador Jeff Raby. So we have an active debate about it. But of course, in China, there is no debate. And I just think the way that the Chinese diplomats, the Chinese government has handled it has left no room at all in Australia's public opinion for people to try and advocate a sort of more close relationship with China, because how can anybody support that at the moment, given what's going on with all these measures? It doesn't mean that the Australian side has handled things perfectly, far from it. But the Chinese government has really basically left themselves with no position to make new friends. And I don't think they really care, to be honest.
Yeah, I just very recently just read a piece saying that late in 2019, Paul Keating, the former prime minister there, criticized the Australian media and even the Australian intelligence services, saying that they were basically hysterical about China and that they didn't understand China. I mean, are you familiar with that? And do you think is he a voice in the wilderness here? First Bill and then Michael.
Yeah, well, I mean, Paul Keating has a great reputation for a way with words, and he's skewered many people over the years, domestic politicians. So I think he was calling the spooks donkeys or something. These donkeys in the spy agency, they've gone feral or something like that. Now, actually, I remember he did this before the last federal election, and then he went out late. The Labor Party, his party, trotted him out 2 days later or so to make him go back on what he'd said, because it's one thing to say, oh, these idiots don't understand China. These guys are cowboys. They're But then the reality is, when you push people who are critical of the Australian government's policies on China, if you push them on what would you do differently, that's where they start to get rather vague. You say, would you plug Huawei into Australia's critical interest? Oh, no, we wouldn't do that. Okay, so should we not have anti-foreign interference law? Oh, no, we do. No, there's a problem. Foreign interference is a problem. And so you get a lot of these people in the Australian debate, whether it's, Paul Keating or Gareth Evans, another former foreign minister, or Andrew Robb, a former trade minister, or all these type, Bob Carr, a former foreign minister. They're very good at criticising the Australian government's actions, they're not so great at enunciating what they would do differently, aside from saying we would not be so strident in our language. But aside from that, it's very difficult to tease out of them some sort of concrete difference on substantive policy.
Michael, do you want to weigh in on Paul Keating saying the media and even the intelligence agencies don't understand what they're doing and are hypercritical and paranoid about China?
Yeah, I mean, I do hear a lot of criticism of the Morrison government, and I mean, I guess I'm working for a business. You know, I was at a dinner the other night with 20 guys who all do business with China, and you know, some of them own quite big companies, so they're all privately. They won't say it in public because they don't want to be labelled a panda hugger, but they're all very critical of the Morrison government, and they, you know, their line is that, you know, God, these guys know nothing about Asia, and they, you know, when they talk to China, they don't know how to talk to China, and other countries like Japan and even New Zealand sort of do manage to pull it off more diplomatically. So that, I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's sort of their line. I think they feel that some of the language we use isn't that diplomatic. Perhaps some of our senior politicians really don't understand China, and that's sort of one criticism that comes out. But as Bill said, no one seems to have a magical solution, and I think the way China's responded, it's just gone way too far, and I don't think there's any turning back from that. So, you know, I think we're in a pretty tough situation.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you both a question. I mean, I'm a university teacher of journalism now, and as I understand it, the Australian universities, many of them came to depend on Chinese students coming in. Obviously, because of the pandemic, there may have been this year where that didn't happen. But is that going to be a real problem in the future going forward? How dependent had they become? Can they afford to not have all these Chinese students coming in from the mainland to Australia? Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a massive problem, and look, it's actually not all political. It's you know, Australia has, you know, we've sort of got this sort of fortress mentality here in terms of COVID. We've managed to keep COVID pretty much under control, and our borders look like they're going to stay closed perhaps until the middle of next year. So the foreign students just aren't coming here. So regardless of what China thinks of us, or regardless of what China are telling their students, they're not coming here anyway. They're going to apply for universities in the UK and the US and other parts of the world, because they can just actually get into those countries. And then, of course, it's being compounded by, you know, China's attitude towards Australia. And I don't think we know how that's going to play out until the borders are open. I mean, there's sort of lots of reports of, you know, education agents in China sort of telling students, oh, don't go to Australia. And you get these odd sort of state media reports about Australia being racist and students being attacked occasionally. So that's obviously going to sway sentiment as well. But I think we've just got to wait really until the borders reopen. I mean, Australia also our economy relies heavily on Chinese tourism. So again, we don't know how that's going to be affected when things return to normal.
And stay with you just for a minute, Michael. That huge presence of Australian students at universities also over the years raised questions of academic freedom, whether people could talk openly about questions about Taiwan or other contentious issues. I mean, how do you weigh that? How do you weigh the benefit of the economic benefit of getting all these students versus questions about, you know, academic freedom, professors afraid to mention things in classrooms?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, there's a huge debate going on about the quality of some of the students coming into Australia. I mean, there were students, getting degrees in Australia when you know, perhaps their English wasn't even very good. So there was sort of this argument about, well, you know, it is all driven by money, and it probably is. And then, yeah, of course, we had a lot of incidents where you know, there was a backlash against lecturers because they said something about Taiwan, and Hong Kong was a real issue there for a while, you know, on campuses, and it's generated a lot of concern in Australia about, you know, whether free speech on Australian soil has actually been threatened in Australian universities, because there has been pushback from groups of students, often very nationalistic students, and there are a lot of divisions in universities around the Hong Kong issue. So that was sort of an enormous concern. But at the same time, yeah, the university sector's really profited from Chinese students. But I mean, one other thing to say about that was my experience in China in terms of you'd meet people and say, well, what do you think about Australia? And they all quite liked Australia. And that was because most of them knew people who went to university there. I mean, every Chinese person I met had a son or a daughter studying in Australia or a relative, and they actually had sort of very favourable opinions in Australia based on those students' experiences. So in a way, it kind of enhanced the people-to-people relationships. But obviously, at the moment, that's all been severed a bit by COVID.
I'm not sure I met anybody who doesn't like Australia. I thought everybody liked Australia.
Oh, it's not perfect.
Bill, you've been on the move. We've seen. What do you think about that? Is this a big issue, or could this be a big financial issue for universities that have relied on Chinese students coming in, and could this be a problem in the future for their financial well-being?
Well, I would say that the answer is obviously yes, but you possibly have a bit of an issue where if Chinese students and their parents, who basically fund their overseas study, if they don't go to Australia because the politics is bad, but they want an English language Western education, well, what are their other options? So you've got the United States. Well, the politics isn't great with the US. I mean, there's this deference in China to the US, of course. But if you don't like Australian political values, then the US surely is not an appealing option. Obviously, the US has the world's best universities. So if your kid's smart enough, sure. But otherwise, or connected enough, I mean, let's face it, Xi Jinping sent his daughter to Harvard. So they're obviously, even among the reddest of the red, there's still this reverence for American education. And then, of course, you've got Canada. Well, relations with Canada are not great. You've got the UK, which is where Bo Xilai sent his son, Bo Guagua. I mean, the UK, they're phasing out Huawei. I mean, the point is, all these similar nations to Australia, they all have political problems with China. So if families really were to divert, or maybe New Zealand, you could send the kids to New Zealand, but of course, New Zealand in the Chinese imagination is a pretty small place. So if you're going to not send your kids to Australia because you don't like the politics, because you're really that patriotic, then I don't think the alternatives are particularly appealing either. So I think there'll certainly be a drop, because all these safety warnings that the Chinese government puts out, they do have real affect. I do remember getting a WeChat message from some random that I met in Dalian during a reporting assignment, and she messaged me sort of like a year later, and she said, hey, is it true that is it true that Chinese are being beaten in the streets of Australia? That was the sort of impression that she'd somehow gathered from the Chinese government's information campaign about safety. So I do think there'll be a drop-off, no doubt about it. But I just think long term, if the Chinese government goes out of its way to really try and smear Australian education and say Australia's such a terribly racist country, Chinese are being attacked there all the time, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, too many people have connections to Australia in China, whereby they know a lot of this isn't what the government's saying it is. But the second thing is, I just think, unless you're going to stay in China and study a bit of Xi Jinping thought or something in your Marxism classes at university, if you really want a Western education, the alternatives are quite similar to Australia anyway, in terms of the sort of poor political relationships that those countries have with China.
I mentioned earlier that we have Rebecca here, who's going to be the question asker, but I think she's going to also tell you that we still have some time to take a couple of audience questions. Rebecca, how do they ask a question if they're interested?
Yeah, if you have questions, guys, please do send them in. It's question@fcchk.org. That's question singular at fcchk.org. I do have one serious question and one not so serious question for you two. The serious question is, so, you know, on the surface, it seems like we've had a complete breakdown in the Australia-China relationship, but do you get the sense from your contacts that there's work going on behind the scenes? Are there still back doors open? Are diplomats still talking? And then the not so serious question is, Bill, where did you get your glasses from?
Just on that first one, so I think Mike was probably listening to it the other day. The Australian ambassador, Graham Fletcher, was doing a webinar, and somebody asked him a question just like that. And he said that, yes, business as usual continues in terms of, you know, normal day-to-day diplomatic channels. But, you know, for example, as an ambassador, he still has meetings with various Chinese counterparts in Beijing. But obviously at any substantially high level, no, that's all completely frozen. And of course, I think that has a follow-on effect. It permeates down to lower levels where I don't know, but I assume that even though the ambassador would still be meeting people from time to time, his social calendar in Beijing is probably not as busy as it would have been in normal times. You know, it wouldn't be as people wouldn't be as proactive about inviting the Australians for events or product launches or whatever the heck they usually do. Yeah, that's what I've been able to gather from listening to the Australian diplomats. Just quickly on the glasses, I got them from Pan Jiayuan in Beijing. Anybody who has lived up in Beijing knows the antiques market, and next to the antiques market, there's Shirley He's the animal market. Anyway, you can. So I've got about 10 pairs of them.
Might be a while before anyone can get there.
On the diplomatic side, look, it's completely broken down, I think, and you know, it's been publicised that, you know, our ministers publicly complain that their counterparts in Beijing won't return phone calls, and you know, I spoke to diplomats a lot in Shanghai, and they just said they had no access to anyone. I mean, it really did completely break down. That's a short summary. Yeah.
A good but short summary. Can I ask both of you a question here? Am I on here? Just I'm curious because, you know, when you have to leave a place like very abruptly, like you did, there must be some things that you miss. I mean, you know, Bill, I'm jealous of your glasses, and I may have to go there at some point and get, you know, a pair of those myself. But I mean, I'll start with you, Bill. You were in Beijing. You had to leave very abruptly. What do you miss?
I miss the street life buzz of having 20 million people living in the same place. You know, Australia's a quiet place, and I just miss that daily buzz of people walking around everywhere. Maybe it's not as dense as Hong Kong, for example, but Beijing at any time of the day or night, there's always people on the street. And there's just an energy that these large cities have, which quiet old Sydney or even more quiet Tasmania don't have. And of course,
it's pretty quiet outside here at the moment.
There's plenty of people like that, but I like the buzz, which is why I'm off to Jakarta next. I just can't get enough of it.
The Jakarta does have a buzz. Michael, what do you miss?
Well, I miss my dog. My dog's stuck in Shanghai. Can't get him out. He's not a hostage. It's just a COVID thing. There's no flights.
Is his name Michael?
No, his name's Huey. But anyway, he's been well looked after. And, you know, I miss my friends. I didn't get to say goodbye to any of my friends when I left. But, you know, of course, I really miss China. And I feel like I was only there 3 years and I just scratched the surface. And, you know, I had a list a mile long of stories I wanted to do and places I wanted to go. So never quite got to do them. And yeah, so, you know, I do miss the place. Hope to get back one day. I don't think it's going to be in the short term though.
I was just going to ask that question. Do you think you'll get back, Michael?
I think in the short term, it'll be very difficult. I mean, my government's advised me that, you know, we shouldn't go back in the medium term. My employer certainly wouldn't let me go back to China and perhaps not even Hong Kong at the moment. So, it'll be very difficult, I think. But who knows? Let's see what happens in the next couple of years, and hopefully can get back one day.
And Bill, can you or can your partner go back?
Yeah, same as Mike. Short term, not going to happen. Longer term, it's not personal. If politics change, we can probably go back. My partner can go back. She's fine. There's no risk to her. Obviously, COVID's the issue at the moment that makes it all impossible to do anything. Here's a question, though. Would you want to go back and work in the media the way things currently are? If I could go back tomorrow, say I didn't have this other job lined up, and they said, get back on a plane and go back to Beijing and resume the posting. Well, I suppose I would, because I still like I still find it's the biggest story in the world, but it's just so bloody difficult to do anything up there these days. You'd see the ones who are still on the ground up in Beijing, and they go on holiday to somewhere like Suzhou, and they get followed by, plainclothes police, and there was somebody banging on about how they were rejected from a restaurant or a bar or something, or blood donation today because foreigners weren't allowed in Shanghai, or, this sort of stuff. It obviously happens from time to time, but I just think being in the media in China in 2021 is not particularly good. And it might be better to see how things are looking in 5 years' time or so.
It's not like the old fun go-go days of the 90s or even 2009, 2010, 2011. Open, internet open. You could find all kinds of great stories. I think Rebecca Rebecca is eyeing me as if she has a question here.
I have several questions.
Oh.
Clearly, the glasses answer has opened the floodgates. So the first question we have is from one of our members. It says, do you get the sense the Chinese leadership feels that its foreign policy is working?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think they do. I think if you look at coronavirus, so this is not a foreign policy thing, but I think we've all read about how there's tremendous confidence up there in China now within the government about its handling of coronavirus compared to the West, compared to India, compared to basically pretty much anywhere except Australia. Although compared to Australia, because we've got no vaccines over here, basically. So, that's not really foreign policy per se, but it kind of speaks to a confidence that the model, the authoritarian model, the patriotic model, the unified model, you don't have, I'm sure they were looking at the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, and instead of sort of, trying to celebrate diversity and trying to rectify past wrongs, I would guess they would look at that and say, oh, how divisive this is. If you give people rights and you encourage people to celebrate different identities, then this chips away at the national unity. I'm sure that's how they look at it when you look at their policies and things like Xinjiang. So it appears to me, even though it looks like a bit of a train wreck, the diplomacy from abroad, domestically, they appear to think that they're on the right track. Mike?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the mood in China is very nationalistic, and particularly, we saw this emerge around April last year, and this very confident China emerged from the pandemic, and you'd think now with even Europe pushing back that China might back off a bit, but there's no sign of that happening. So I think they believe their foreign policies are working, but it does look like a bit of a car crash. They're managing to get every country in the world offside. I mean, they've now got the Philippines offside. The Philippines were on side until recently, until they started sort of sending, Chinese military into their sort of territorial waters. So, I think we're dealing with a very, very confident power that they don't want to play second fiddle to the US anymore, and they feel that there's perhaps no need to.
And sort of following on from that, a question from Richard Ward. What does the trajectory of Australia-China relations portend for relations with other countries? So, Bill, you mentioned before the UK and America. I mean, do you think this is a blueprint for the future?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, Australia is obviously more hooked on Chinese cash than any of those other countries, but People always talk about canary in the coal mine. They talk about Australia being used as an example to others. That pretty much appears to be the case. Australia is special, though, compared to countries in Europe and so forth, because Australia is in Asia, or sort of Asia Pacific. And for that reason, I suspect the Chinese government has an extra special interest in trying to long-term steer Australia away from the US alliance. Same with New Zealand. Whereas I don't think there would be a similar expectation for countries that are in Europe or, you know, Canada, for example. I think there's a real particular emphasis on China eventually being the dominant power in this region where Australia is. But nonetheless, you look at the way up in mainland China, the way people have been carrying on about H&M and, you know, who was that wrestler who apologized the other day, John Cena and stuff. You know, just in general, all of these things set a precedent. Every single time you see one of these things, people internalize this response from Beijing that, my God, they're super, super sensitive about this topic, that topic. So if you ever, in any way, are dealing with these topics, you got to walk on eggshells. You got to pre-program in Beijing's reaction before you do anything. And I think this is all very deliberate. And the end result is people start self-censoring, or they start making decisions based on an expected response from Beijing.
We do have other questions, but unfortunately I have to hand back to Keith because we're running out of time. Sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't get to.
Well, I'm sure they're fantastic questions. I hope we answered some of them here. But, you know, before we got a couple of minutes left, before we let you guys go, first of all, I want to plug your books. Bill Birtles, your book is called The Truth About China, correct? And it's out now. It's for sale.
That is correct, yes.
Where is it available? Can people in Hong Kong buy it? You have a copy of it. Can you show it to us?
I don't think, it's not on sale in Hong Kong, and I don't know if it will be.
It will be. Well, maybe
you
not.
Can buy it on.
Go ahead.
I'm sure you can buy it on. You can buy it on Kindle. You can get it on Kindle. You can get it on audiobook. But yeah, there it is. I hope Mike's got a copy to hold up of his own.
I don't.
It's a truth about China. Possibly available on Amazon. Maybe available at Bookazine. We don't know yet. And Bill's going to run out and find if he's got another copy of something else here.
Oh, thanks, Bill.
Oh, you got Michael Smith.
He's a good sport. I'm traveling, so I don't have one.
The last, great name, The Last Correspondent, Dispatches from the Front Line of Xi's New China, published by a great name for the press, Ultimo Press. So it's The Last Correspondent, Ultimo Press. Is that right?
That's right.
Smith. So you got the two books right there.
It's their first book. You can get it in Hong Kong. About 6 of my friends ordered it on Book Depository. Happy to send you the link. It's bookdepository.com, and they got it shipped to Hong Kong within about a week.
Book Depository. Okay, yeah. And you're now on a book tour in Tasmania, so it's obviously available in Tasmania. Is that correct? It
is. I'm meant to be going to Melbourne next week, but there's a bit of a lockdown there, so possibly not.
Okay, we've got about a minute left. We always ask all of our guests one question. I'm sorry I didn't prep you ahead of time, but you got a lot of time now in lockdown and the pandemic. What are you reading now that you might recommend to all the people listening here? It doesn't have to be politics or China. It could be a novel. It could be fiction or just whatever. What are you reading now? Start with you, Bill.
Go Mike first. Go Mike.
Okay, Michael, what are you reading now?
It's a bit boring. I've got to plug another China book that I've got a chapter in. It's called The Beijing Bureau. It's a collection of essays by 20 or so very, very experienced and talented China correspondents. It's a fantastic book, and it sort of goes back to Mao's era, covering sections of Chinese history. So it's a great read. Look, the other book I'm reading, I don't know how much interest it will be to people in Hong Kong, is a book called Toxic by Richard Flanagan. So Richard Flanagan's a Tasmania Booker Prize-winning author, sort of renowned for his literary works, but he's just written this non-fiction book about exposing the Tasmanian salmon industry, and it's sort of creating a lot of shockwaves down here.
Excellent. The Beijing Bureau and Toxic by Richard Flanagan.
Yeah.
And that's given you moments to think, Bill.
This is only one for people who are having a baby, but I'm just reading Baby on Board by an Australian doctor called Howard Chilton. It's one of the best baby books you can read. It's down to earth. It's great. Only for those who are at that stage.
Baby on board. Baby on board. All right. We had Ling Ling Wei from the Wall Street Journal earlier, who just had a baby, and she said she's been reading Dr. Seuss. And so without further ado, Bill Birtles, thank you very much. Coming to us from Sydney, soon, hopefully in Jakarta. He's got his beer. We've got our wine here that's going to be soon refilled. Michael Smith, coming to us from Tasmania, Hobart, I imagine.
Hobart, yeah. I actually live in Sydney, and hopefully I'll be living in Tokyo in about 4 or 5 weeks. I'm not quite sure.
We have made news here. Michael Smith, soon to be based in Tokyo. Excellent. And with me in the room here, Rebecca, our amazing team here at the FCC who have made this thing work without any mechanical glitches. Thank you very much. And for all of you who have been watching, thank you. And we will see you at our next event, hopefully be here Wednesday, if you want to know when you can take your masks off, if you've been vaccinated, and other questions, vaccines and variants. I'm Keith Richburg, President of the FCC. Thank you for joining us. Thank you guys. Thank you guys. Good luck. Hope you get back to China.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.